Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. So as Kathy explained, I am based at the Centre for Research in Autism Education, CRAE in London. And the aim of our centre is, we are a research centre, we aim to conduct really high quality scientific research. But importantly, we really strive for that research to have a very positive impact on the lives of autistic people. And also, we are really keen to engage with the autistic community and the broader autism community, so families and professionals who work with autistic people, to really shape the way that we do the research within our centre, in terms of the questions that we focus on, in terms of the way that we design the studies, and in terms of the ways that we interpret and disseminate them. And this ethos stems from a piece of work that was done by the two former directors of our centre, Professor Liz Pellicano and Professor Tony Charman. And this was a project called The Future Made Together, Shaping Autism Research in the UK. And the impetus for this project was because many people had noticed what they perceived to be a big translational gap in autism research. So this is the idea that more and more autism research is taking place in the UK and internationally. But actually, when you ask autistic people or their family members or the professionals working with them, what impact has this had on your lives? More often than not, the answer is fairly little. So the Future Made Together project wanted to look at this in a bit more detail. They wanted to look at the landscape of autism research. So what kind of research is going on? What's being funded? What's being published? And they wanted to see if this aligned with what the autism community wanted to see from research. The other thing that they wanted to do was look at community involvement in research. So do autistic people and their families and the professionals working with them get to hear about the research taking place? Do they get to have discussions with researchers about that work that's going on? And are they actually meaningfully involved in shaping that research together and collaboratively? And the research painted a really quite bleak picture of the state of autism research in the UK. So the majority of research tended to focus on biology, brain and cognition in autism. And while the autism community thought that this had value, actually what they wanted was research that more accurately reflected their day-to-day life and had a more immediate impact on them. When asking about community involvement in research, researchers said that they were doing fairly well in this area. So they thought they were disseminating their research to the community quite well, they were engaging in discussions about that work. But actually, when you asked the autism community, they didn't really share that view. So they often had very negative experiences of taking part in research. And also, when they did speak to researchers about their work, they felt that actually, no matter what they said, unfortunately, it wouldn't have much of an impact on the research taking place. And the one thing that all groups did agree on in this kind of consultation exercise was the fact that active research partnerships where the autistic community and the research community work together to co-produce or co-create research was a very rare occurrence indeed. So one thing that's been suggested as a way to address some of these issues is participatory research. And what I mean by this is quite nicely illustrated through what's known as the ladder of citizen participation. So this is taken from Sherry Arnstein, and it wasn't actually designed for autism research or even research at all, but the principles of this still seem to apply. So the gist of this is that one might argue that in autism research generally, autistic people and their allies tend to have not very much power in the research process. The research is about them, but not really with them. If you move up to the kind of middle rungs of the ladder is what's seen to be called degrees of tokenism. So things like informing people about research and engaging in discussions with them. And I should say actually, I don't think that this is a negative thing. I think that has a really important place and that researchers need to strive to disseminate their research as well as they can and to consult with people in a really, really genuine and meaningful way. But what it's been argued is that we should strive to go even beyond that. So we need to move to these kind of degrees of citizen power, where autistic people and researchers are working in partnership to co-produce research. There's much more power given to the autism community, and even in some cases citizen control, where the autistic people are really leading the research agenda. And I really like this definition of participatory research as well, because many people say, well, how do you do this? But it's not really a method or a set of methodologies, it's really an attitude that someone has to have, a mindset, a belief that autistic people do have something to offer this process. And that's the ethos that we really try to embody within our centre, and it's nice to see that in Autism Manchester as well. So I'm going to talk about participatory research today, but it's not really a kind of how-to guide. What I'm hoping to do is to talk you through a piece of participatory research that I've been involved in, as just one example of one of the many ways that this kind of work can be done. This is a project that I was very privileged to work on called Know Your Normal. It was a project that was in collaboration with the charity Ambitious About Autism. And Ambitious About Autism have, as part of their charity, a youth council. So this is a group of young autistic people, all between the ages of 16 to 25, who work together on projects and campaigns to try to make life better for other young autistic people in England. And the Youth Council got together a couple of years ago now, and they were given free rein to focus on whatever they wanted in their project, and unanimously they felt that the #1 priority for them was mental health. And this aligns with lots of other priority setting exercises done by other charities such as Autistica, and it was something that they were really passionate about producing something on. So they wanted to set up a campaign, and they wanted this to be underpinned by research, but they'd never done research before. So they approached our centre and said, you know, this is what we want to do, can you help us achieve it? So myself and Professor Liz Pelicano, who was then our director at Cray, got together. This picture on the left is the first time we ever met the young people we worked with. So Jack Welsh, Georgia Harper and Fern Adams from Ambitious About Autism. We came together in this room and essentially we said to them, okay, what do you want to do and how can we help you achieve it? So they spoke about what they wanted to do in their campaign, and we spoke to them as well about how research works and the kind of milestones that you need to go through. And one of the key things we did was to try to help them take one of these ideas that they had and narrow them down into answerable and novel research questions. So the questions that we helped them to develop were as follows. So first of all, how do young autistic people interpret normal mental health? So on a day-to-day basis, what is a good level of well-being for these young people? We then wanted to know, if they were experiencing mental health problems, how does their level of well-being, their normal, change? Does it change, and if so, how does it change? We then wanted to find out that if they did have a mental health problem and wanted to seek help for this, what were their experiences of accessing that support? So those were the questions that we jointly decided that we were going to answer through this project. And actually they had many, many more research questions than this, and I think a big challenge was trying to narrow them down onto something that we could do within the very, very short time frame that we had. In terms of who took part in our research, the eligibility was the same as that to take part in the Ambitious Youth Council. So it's for young people who were 16 to 25 years of age, all of whom were on the autistic spectrum and were living in England. And we chose to seek their views through two methods. An online survey in which we had 109 young people take part, and then some in-depth interviews with the young people to probe some of their experiences in a bit more depth. Now, one thing that I want to be really upfront upfront about is that by using these methods, of survey and interviews, we do limit our sample of autistic people to a very specific subgroup on the autistic spectrum. So those who tended to have good spoken or written language abilities. And it's perhaps unsurprising, most of them had a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. So they didn't have a diagnosed intellectual disability, and they didn't have a history of early language delay. And as I say, we have been criticised for this, because many people argue that actually this cohort of people that we're looking at, they're perhaps not a priority in autism. Perhaps we need to focus on those who have more complex needs and higher levels of support. And I take that point, and I do think that there's not enough research on that population of autistic people. But one thing that I find really, really striking from this project was that if you look at the profile of our young people on paper, in terms of their level of education, they all do very, very well educationally, in terms of their rates of post-secondary education, and also in terms of their employment status. These young people are ticking all of the boxes. If you ask what a good outcome was for a young autistic person, it would be these young people in abundance. And yet, as I'll go on to explain, when you look at their mental health, actually it's really, really poor. And I think that just shows how, this is not a group of young people whose needs that we should be overlooking. Their needs are very different, but yet equally important, I would argue. So I'll talk you through the kind of key findings, first of all from our survey, and then I'll move on to the interview data. So our online survey had just over 100 young people take part, and we had 3 key findings from this. So the first was that we aimed to look at what normal mental health baseline levels of well-being were amongst this group of young people. And what we found was that on a day-to-day basis, when these young people weren't experiencing a mental health problem as such, their levels of well-being were fairly low. So we gave them a series of statements in a range of different categories, and they spoke of how, on a day-to-day basis, they tended to report feelings of unhappiness and depression. They felt unable to overcome their difficulties, under strain, worthless, lacking in confidence, and the list goes on and on and on. And we gave them a standard measure of quality of life as well. Again, so just on a day-to-day basis, how they were feeling. And their levels of their quality of life were lower than you would expect for a group of non-autistic young people. And perhaps not surprisingly, our group showed quite high rates of mental health problems as well. So around 80% of the young people who took part in our research, consistent with lots of other research in this area, experiencing mental health problems. And something else I think was really important to come from this survey was that we found that the young people had what we refer to as poor mental health literacy. So this refers to knowing that you're experiencing a mental health problem. So we know that in the typical population, sometimes it can be quite hard to know if the symptoms that you're feeling do reflect a mental health problem in need of seeking support. But what we found is that this was particularly difficult for our group of young autistic people. And we think that the reason for this is because if you are not autistic, you will know that you're experiencing a mental health problem because you will develop some symptoms and some features that you wouldn't have had before. For our young autistic people, we found that generally they were struggling in lots of areas. And when they were experiencing mental health problems, it wasn't that brand new symptoms were coming up. It was that the things they were struggling with anyway on a day-to-day basis were just exacerbated. And what this meant was that it was really difficult for them to know that they were experiencing a mental health problem and they needed to seek support for that. But also it was really difficult for people around them to know that actually, these features or these symptoms are severe enough to actually warrant help and support for them. So based upon these findings, the young people that we worked with as part of the Broader Youth Council developed what they called the Know Your Normal Toolkit. So this is a series of cards that you can download on the Know Your Normal website. And the cards are in a range of different areas of relevance to a person's life, so such as staying healthy, interests and hobbies, relationships, self-care, and so on. And on the back of the cards are a series of questions. And the idea is that the young person would use these cards and complete these cards at a time when they were feeling quite good about themselves, when they were happy with their normal. Then, if at any time a young person would think, well actually, something doesn't feel quite right, it feels like something has changed, they can go back to these cards, and they're not diagnostic, but what it means is that they can map out how they're feeling now. And they can see, you know, this is how I was feeling when I was feeling okay, you know, this is what my normal is. And actually, things have changed and now it's like this. So, you know, my normal might not be the same as everybody else's, but, you know, something has changed and I'm not comfortable with it. And they can see that really objectively for themselves. And it also serves as a kind of self-advocacy tool. So they could take it to a healthcare professional to map out, you know, this is normal for me, this is what I'm happy with, this is how things have changed, and this is why I feel that I need support in this area. Now, I was hoping to show you this wonderful animation that the young people made to demonstrate how the toolkit works, but unfortunately we don't have sound to be able to play it. But if you go onto YouTube and type in Know Your Normal, Ambitious About Autism or something similar, or if you go on the Know Your Normal website, it's a very, very short video, but it's a lovely illustration of the way that the toolkit can help young autistic people map out what normal is for them. So that was the results of our survey. Oh, I guess on to the next slide. I'm going to move on now to the results of our interviews. Now, throughout the course of this project, we were really, really keen to have our autistic co-researchers contribute as much as possible. And one of the things we were really hoping was that they would be able to carry out the interviews for the project. But actually, when we spoke to them, this wasn't something that they felt comfortable and confident in doing. And this was for a number of reasons. Firstly, we had a very tight schedule on the project itself, and they were worried that there wouldn't be enough time for training in interviewing for them to go out and interview their peers about their mental health problems. And they were particularly concerned that this was a very, very sensitive issue, and they were worried about what would happen if someone disclosed something and they didn't know how to cope in that situation. But they were also concerned about the fact that they worked for the charity or volunteered for the charity in a position where they support other young autistic people and interact with them. And they worried that the people that they'd be interviewing perhaps wouldn't feel as confident and as open in talking to them about some of their very sensitive mental health issues in case they encountered them at one of the kind of Ambitious About Autism events or something like this. So they asked if I would do the interviews, and I did, but we supported the young people to be able to analyse the interviews themselves. So we spoke them through how to analyse qualitative data, how to draw the key themes from the data, and they chose all of the quotes that were used to illustrate the themes. So we went on to publish this in a report and in an academic journal, and if you read through it, it really is what the young people themselves identified as being important from the data. Not something that we kind of thought was really key. It really is their voices coming through, which is really key. The other thing to mention as well that was really quite incredible about this project was that these interviews were really, really hard to carry out. These young people had had such a terrible time with their mental health, and it really was just a testament to them that they were willing to sit there and to be interviewed about these really, really difficult experiences just to make things better for other young autistic people. So we're enormously grateful that they shared their experiences with us. But 4 key themes came from these data. So the first really echoed what we found in our survey, which was that young autistic people struggle to know whether the difficulties they're experiencing are due to autism or due to a co-occurring mental health problem. And it really just illustrates the challenges that young autistic people face navigating a non-autistic world. And this was illustrated beautifully in one of the interviews that we did via instant messenger, so people could take part in the interviews however they felt comfortable, whether that's face-to-face, on the phone, via Skype, or text message or email. And this young person said that they think the reason that so many people with autism develop mental health conditions is because of the way that they're treated. They go on to say from early childhood, autistic kids are excluded, frowned upon, and made to feel unnatural. We're constantly pressured to be more normal, whatever that means. I think that if somebody who wasn't autistic grew up being excluded, bullied, and pressured to be something that they're not, they'd very likely develop the same conditions. And I think that's something for us all to reflect on in World Autism Awareness Week. Another key thing that came through from the interviews was stigma. And this was something that came up in every interview, but in very different ways. So some people were very, very reluctant to discuss their mental health problems, especially people with less common mental health problems, such as personality disorders or hallucinations or delusions. Other young people as well were really reluctant to talk about their autism diagnosis, particularly girls on the autistic spectrum who thought that people had a very stereotypical view of what autism was. And they spoke a lot about, especially this group of young autistic people, they spoke about how they felt that they were seen as not being normal enough to fit in, but not different enough to be normal. It's this very, very difficult position that they felt they held in society. And it meant that people didn't really understand their need for support as much as other people. If the young autistic people did identify they were experiencing mental health problems, did overcome the stigma, and went on to talk to people about it, what they reported as well was lots and lots of barriers to accessing appropriate support. So they spoke about a lack of available services, so very, very often they tried to seek help for their mental health and was told, actually, we've got nothing to support you. They often had a referral to mental health services. There were lots of delays to get into the top of the waiting list, to get seen. By the time they got there, they were told, well, no, you're autistic, you need to go to autism services. So they'd go back to the bottom of the queue, they'd have their lengthy wait to access the autism service, they would get there and they'd be told, well, no, this is a mental health problem. There was a lack of services to meet the needs of autistic people with mental health problems, even though we know that that is very, very common. They reported how services weren't tailored to their individual needs. Very often the young people knew what would and wouldn't work for them, but people had preconceived ideas about what kind of support they would need. If they chose not to take those up, often there were no other options available to them. And something else that came up quite a lot was how there were some really wonderful services being offered by charities, but often these were very short term. It was this lack of ongoing support that was a real problem. And disjointed services and poor transitions really came up. So remember, these are young people between the ages of 16 to 25. So often when they first encountered mental health services, it was through child and adolescent mental health services. And they found this to be a really great way to access support because appointments were really regular, they got to develop relationships with the clinicians working with them. It wasn't just for when they were in mental health crisis, there was an acknowledgement they needed this ongoing support. But as one young person put it, you turn 18 and suddenly your services go poof and they disappear. So once they did turn 18, adult mental health services wouldn't see you on such a regular basis. They would only see you if you were in mental health crisis. There wasn't as much acknowledgement that people, did suddenly turn 18 and their support needs go. They had to make their own appointments. Their families weren't allowed to do this on their behalf. So that support was really, really lacking. And this was at a time in their lives when they needed it more than ever. You know, often they're transitioning from school to university or school to the workplace, and there just wasn't enough support to bridge this gap. And it was really tricky actually when we were writing this, because these things aren't easy to address. You know, changing or addressing some of these things would require massive changes to the way that our National Health Service is put together. And we know that that's not going to happen. But ultimately, when you kind of broke it down to what the young people were really, really asking for, it came down to trusting relationships. So they spoke about how what they wanted was someone they can trust, someone they can talk to, and someone who understands autism, a professional person. And when they kind of put it like that, you think, is this too much for us to be offering them? So on the basis of our findings, the young people wrote a policy report, which you can access from the website, and they came up with 3 key recommendations in the area. So more initiatives to reduce the stigma associated with autism and mental health, greater training for professionals, and more autistic involvement in the design and delivery of services. And I think it was the autistic involvement that actually transcends all 3 of these things. So that's the results of the research. I think one of the really important things about this project was the way, it wasn't just what we found, it was the way that we co-created this project. And what you find is that often researchers don't talk about how this is done. And we talk about it a little bit in our reports, but we really wanted to find a way of sharing this message more widely and to encourage other people to think about adopting this way of working. So we've created some blog posts and also some videos where together we kind of outline the process of researching in partnership, looking at some of the ways that it worked really, really well. And, I think in many ways it certainly did. We probably could have done this project by ourselves, but it wouldn't have been anywhere near as good if we didn't have the involvement of these young people. But also challenges along the way and how we try to overcome those. So if you're interested in that part of the process, I'd encourage you to take a look at those. And this is my show-off slide now. So we were really, really honoured to be recognised for some of this work. So the top left is myself and Georgia collecting an award for Public Engagement Team of the Year from the head of UCL, where I work. On the right here, I was invited to meet the Princess of Denmark, who's the patron to the Danish Autism Organisation, to speak about the Know Your Woman work. And I was really proud of that. And then Jack trumped me by meeting Prince William, who we know obviously has an interest in mental health. And Jack was able to talk a bit about the Know Your Woman work. So, rest assured, as well as sharing this with you, it's also been shared with various members of various whole families and the head of UCL. So, that's the Know Your Woman project. And as I said, we found the process of working together really, really beneficial, but we know that this isn't the norm in autism research. We know that more often than not, it's the researchers who decide what they're going to focus their research on, how it's going to be done, how they interpret the data, and how they share it. So a little project that we've been working on for the last year or so is that we've been speaking to researchers, those at the early stages of their career and more senior autism researchers, about their views on this participatory working. And I should say as well that within this sample of researchers, some of them are autistic themselves as well. So I certainly, although I often talk about researchers and community members, that's by no means kind of mutually exclusive. And we're still kind of analysing these data now, and I won't talk about them in too much detail. But one of the key things we found is that there is a kind of growing recognition that this is a useful way of working, And it's a way of working that many people are interested in, and importantly, people with influence, like research funders, are increasingly advocating this way of working. And those who do adopt this position do talk about how it makes them do better research. You know, this isn't just a tokenistic way of saying that we're involving people. It actually does make a difference to the quality of the research. But the issue is that many people aren't really sure what counts as participatory. You know, how much involvement do people need to have for it to be truly a participatory project? And this is really important. There's been a wonderful paper that's just been published in the journal Autism by the Aspire team, who are a group of researchers and autistic co-researchers in America. They're led by Christina Nicolidis and Dora Raymaker, who co-lead this program of research. And they've developed some guidelines for researcher community partnerships on how to do this kind of research really well. And one of the things that they caution against is that many people are using these terms to describe their research, but actually there is no power that goes to the participants. And they gave one example of a person who entered into a research project that was billed as participatory in nature, but actually when they got there realised that actually they'd be consulted about some aspects, but it wouldn't actually change necessarily much of the project. And this person said, you know, if my expectations were set out clearly in the first place, fine, but we need to be very careful that we don't overstate what we're doing. And I think one of the other key things that came out was that researchers do need a lot of support in this area to know how to do it properly. They spoke about a lot of barriers and a lot of challenges in relation to this way of working. And I've certainly encountered a lot in the participatory projects that I've done. University financial systems being one particular academic nightmare. But ultimately, I think we've got to remember that actually it's not just participatory research in autism that's hard. You know, all research is hard and all research has its challenges, and we have to think really creatively about ways to overcome them. And that goes for working with the autistic community in participatory work as well. So I think, yes, there might be barriers, there might be challenges, it might be a new way of working, but we can't just discount it because of that. You know, we need to have this mentality that the autistic community has something really important to offer, and we will try our very hardest to, you know, make sure that that's reflected in our research. And in terms of kind of how to achieve this, our data show that it comes down to a couple of things really. Firstly, really good quality mentoring. So this, I would say, is not just for people at the early stages of their career, but even for more senior researchers. You know, if I'm going to do a research project, looking at some aspect of genetics that I know nothing about, you know, I wouldn't go at it alone. I'd get someone in who knows about that area to collaborate with me. And I think that's the kind of mindset that we need when we think about participatory working. You know, there's so many great examples of research centres working in this way, whose expertise can be drawn on for these projects, and I think we do need to work together a lot more to share examples of best practice. And I think the second thing is really to make sure we work really hard to develop more trusting relationships with our autistic co-researchers. There's a lot of distrust about research in the autistic community, and I think it might take a long while to build a lot of those bridges, but I think it's really important that we keep on trying. And many of the people in our research spoke about just needing kind of somewhere to start, some kind of resource. And one thing that we've created, it's part of the Shape Autism Research Project that was led by Professor Liz Pelicano, looking at how we can make autism research in the UK more participatory in nature. It was originally conceived as a resource for early career researchers, but actually I think it's a resource for anyone. It's free to download from the website, and it just gives you a few tips on best practice in terms of sharing your research, in terms of engaging in collaborations and consultations with people, and also co-producing research. And one final thing that I want to mention, I spoken a lot about kind of co-production of research and co-creation of research. But actually, I think we also have some more fundamental issues in autism research in the UK. And they were really highlighted in the Future Made Together report that I mentioned at the start, which was how the autistic community often have quite negative experiences of taking part in research. So not just, leading the research agenda and co-creating the knowledge, but actually just coming into research centres to participate in research. So a project that we're starting very soon at our centre is called the Research Passport. It was an idea from one of our autistic co-researchers at Cray, Robin Stewart, and it's an idea that came about from other passports used in healthcare and criminal justice as a way of autistic people and family members to convey needs to researchers in advance of people coming to actually take part in the research, to make sure that the research is aware of people's needs and that they can actually do something to address them. So we're going to be starting work on that project for the next year in collaboration with the charity Autistica, so hopefully not just influencing the way that research is co-produced, but also making the experience of research fundamentally better for autistic people as well. And Kathy was waving her hands to tell me to stop, so I will. But before I do, I just want to say thank you to Fern, Jack and Georgia, who co-produced the Know Your Normal project. It really was an absolute privilege and a pleasure to work with them. And to Hannah, who has been interviewing people about their experiences of participatory research. And to my mentor in this area, Liz Pellicano, who's worked with me on all the projects that I've spoken about today, and who is an incredible researcher who really, for me, when I was an early career researcher, really fostered that ethos of participation, which I think is so crucial. And finally, thank you all very, very much for listening.